Hey, welcome, and we are so glad that you're here with us today. My name is Nick, and I'm one of the pastors at River Lake, and we believe church should be relevant, simple, and real. We hope to see you this weekend. Happy Mother's Day. We're so glad you're here today. I want to welcome those watching online. Today, we're celebrating mothers, and one of the things that we're doing is if you go out there, we have what they're calling a momlet station, okay? So it's omelets for moms. If you're a dude, don't even ask, okay? No, you can ask. I just don't know if they'll give it to you. So, but no, we want to serve our moms. We want to do something a little different, a little creative, maybe a little bit over the top. We had them dress up in very nice tuxedo t-shirts, okay? So we just went all out for you. And if you hang out with us, you know that's kind of par for the course. That as a church, we really aspire and work hard at what we would call ridiculous events. We want to do things like fly a helicopter into Glasgow and drop 50,000 eggs for Easter. We want to do things like pay a company to bring a full ice rink in and set it up for the whole city and just say, hey, it's free. We want to bless you. We want to do that. We do things like give cars away. We help people financially who are walking through struggles. We've done police stops. We want to do things over and over and over again to just be ridiculous, because we'll do anything short of sin to help people find and follow Jesus. That's kind of who we are. And one of my favorite ones that we ever did was not on Mother's Day, but it was on Father's Day. And we were asking the question, what do we do? How do we celebrate Father's Day? We had done a couple hot dog eating competitions, and we did like a pump pass competition. And we sat around as a staff, and we said, what do men love to do? And we realized, you know what, men love to throw sharp axes. And so we just like, yes, that sounds like something a church should do. We should throw axes. And so we had an axe throwing competition a few years ago on Father's Day. And here's the post that we put out. We said it this way: join us for Father's Day this weekend as we celebrate with an axe throwing competition. Both men and women can compete, and there will be prizes along with other surprises. Do you know what the surprise was? The women won. That was the surprise. They torched the dudes, okay? It wasn't even close. And then we just said our service times and blah, blah, blah. Hope to see you there. And here's the deal. If you hang out with us, you would look at this and not think twice about it, because you kind of know why we do what we do. But if you don't understand that, you would be like this one gentleman. And one of the pastors in the area, and he's a really sweet guy. I blocked his name because I don't want to embarrass him. But one of the pastors in the area does not understand why we do what we do. And so after this, he posted something, and it was so awesome. I loved it so much. He meant to insult me, but he actually encouraged me. I took a screenshot of it. And here's what this, I would argue, very well-meaning, loves Jesus, I'm sure, pastor said about our church. He said it this way: this is actually disgusting. I could just stop there. That's awesome, okay? Not, and here's his logic, and I totally get it. Not, come and join us to see how Jesus teaches us to be real men. Nope. If you come here, you get to throw an axe, which, again, yes. So anyway, I once overheard one of your members inviting a local young lady to your establishment. That's a great word. She said, I already told you, I am not coming to Six Flags over Jesus. And I read that, yeah. I thought, I want to rename the church to Six Flags over Jesus. That's an awesome title. And here's where I want to go, and here's what I want to talk about today, okay? Because I have a purpose for this. We're walking through our core values. We're walking through the House Party series, and we're celebrating why we do what we do, because it's easy for churches, it's easy for movements, it's easy for any business to start really strong and then forget why you had the success you had. And I believe that God has blessed our church in the first 10 years because of what we did in the first 10 years. That there are some core values, 5 in particular, that really helped us get to this place. And I just want to spend some time reinforcing it and reminding it. And then at the end of it, I want to invite you into something special, to do something a little bit different as we do this. Because our core value number 3, again, as we kind of talk about this, is this: we will be unlike anyone else to reach everyone else. Meaning, here's what I want to talk about. My heart for River Lake is not to compete with other churches, but it's to complete the big C church, the church of God. That it's not to sit back and go, man, I'd love to take, if we could just get, here's what I hear every now and then, if we could just get like 10 more good members. I don't want good members. I want bad, broken, disenfranchised, disconnected people who don't know Jesus. That's what I'm looking for. I'm not interested in competing with other churches. I'm actually interested, and our church is interested, at our core value, we are interested in completing the church, which means we're going to do things radically different. We're going to do things that some other churches sit back and say, it's ridiculous, and I can't believe they would do that. And why would they do that? Why wouldn't you tell people, you know what, come be more like Jesus? At the end of the day, and this is kind of a spoiler alert, the people we're trying to reach have no interest in becoming more like Jesus. But they might be interested in throwing an axe as hard as they could at a piece of wood. That is the kind of person we're going after. But if you don't get kind of what we're going to talk about today, you will miss it. You will think that there is a right way to do church and a wrong way. But here's where I want to go. Here's what I want you to see. I believe this. There is no right way to do church. There are a lot of wrong ways. So again, there's some bad ways to do church, but there's not one right way. And today I want us to look at the book of Acts. It's a story, the book of Acts, on how the church started. And we're going to look at two stories written by the same author in the same book, and they're going to contrast two different ways of, I would argue, doing church, preaching sermons. And it's really, really important as we kind of unpack this. And so here's where we're going to go. Acts chapter 2, it's the first church. Peter stands up, and he starts to preach. And here's what he says. He says it this way. Then Peter stepped forward with the 11 other apostles and shouted to the crowd, because they were being loud and rowdy. Listen carefully, all of you, fellow, and here's a key word, Jews and residents of Jerusalem. He looks at them and says, listen, I know exactly who you are, and I'm going to point out my audience. Make no mistake about this. I love this. These people are not drunk, as some of you are assuming. 9 o'clock in the morning is much too early for that. Which begs the question, at what point is it appropriate to do that? So anyway, is it like happy hour? Like, what is he trying to say there? But anyway, this is important. Here's what he's saying. He starts off, and Peter's going to preach a sermon. He's going to lead thousands of people to Jesus. But don't miss this. He starts with the context. That's really, really important. Context matters. Who am I talking to? If you, husbands, lean in for a second here, it's Mother's Day. If you woke up and you sat next to your wife and you started making googly eyes to her and talking to her like a toddler, how would that go over? Poorly. You know why? You need to recognize who you're talking to. You're talking to your wife. You're talking to a mother. You speak to her based on who she is and what you know about her. Context matters. In every conversation that you have, you do this instinctively. The problem is that many churches do not do this anymore. That they make a fundamental mistake in how they do what they do. And they just do what's always been done because they've never asked the question, why has it been done that way? And so Peter starts and he says, listen, here's the deal. I know who I'm talking about. I'm talking to the Jews and all the residents of Jerusalem. And then he goes on, he says this, we're not drunk. No, what you see was predicted long ago by the prophet Joel. Now here's the deal. This is really, really important. He's going to quote a passage from an Old Testament prophet that half of you in here, you didn't even know there was a prophet Joel, right? You're like, who is Joel? Is he down the street? Like, who's Joel? Like, you didn't even know that was a prophet. They all knew that. Why? Because of the context. And here's the second thing. It's really important. The second thing he does is this. He moves on to culture. See, when you have a conversation with anybody, but most specifically, when you're going to have a conversation, we're going to try to lead them to a place, you better first look at the context and know who you're talking to. You better second, understand what they know and what they don't know. And Peter understands I'm speaking to a Jewish audience who's also in Jerusalem. And you know what? They grew up with the Old Testament. They grew up with all these books. And if they went to the temple regularly, which they should have, all the good little Jews and good little Jewish boys and girls, they would have known it. Some of them memorized it. So when he quotes Joel, everybody's tracking with him. Everybody's going, oh, yeah, I remember that story. And Peter preaches a sermon that is just so powerful. You should read it later. We don't have time to unpack it today. But he's going to unpack exactly what Joel said, and he's going to quote David. He's going to do some different stuff, and then he's going to wrap it up. He's going to say this. Therefore, let all Israel be assured of this. God has made this Jesus, the one I've been talking about, whom you crucified. You killed him. You murdered him. Both Lord and Messiah. And if you grew up in church, it would be easy to read this and make assumptions about this and gloss over this, but make no mistake. This has high emotion. He's saying you crucified it, you murdered God, you've been waiting. And then he taps into what they knew, that they knew the concept of Messiah. They were waiting for a Messiah. They knew and understood the concept of Yahweh, who is the Lord, the God of Israel. They had all that. And Peter wraps it up and says, you murdered God. And what Peter does is so powerful. It's what pastors still do to this day. It's incredibly effective. They use emotion over intellect. And when I say that, I don't mean that they're stupid and it wasn't anything intellectual. No, the point was this. Peter is leveraging a moment that they would have all been aware of. He's leveraging emotion. He's using inflammatory language to invoke a response. And here's the crazy thing. It worked. The thousands of people. In fact, here is the next line. It says this. When the people heard this, they were cut to the heart and said to Peter and the other apostles, brothers, what shall we do? Worked. And here's the deal. This still works. There's a lot of churches high on emotion. Make assumptions about what you know. Speak to a specific audience, a Christian audience that knows the Bible, that knows Joel. They'll start their services out with, hey, could you open up to Romans chapter 5? Or they say certain things, and there is nothing wrong with that. It works. It speaks to a very specific demographic. It is incredible. I have friends of mine who are pastors, high emotion, high on music, high on work. Let's just listen. All emotion, inspirational. They're great churches. Works. The danger is this. When we take our way and think it's the only way, that's when we ultimately get in the way of what God is trying to do. And there's other ways of doing church. In fact, I want to talk to you about a different one in the same book. Because again, there's nothing wrong with starting with the Bible. There's nothing wrong with quoting a whole bunch of Old Testament stuff. There's nothing wrong with any of that stuff, but it's not the only way. In fact, if you read the same book, the same author, he's going to give the same model. And actually, I believe that he is showing that it's the same process with a very different people. And he says in Acts chapter 17, Paul is speaking. And he says it this way. He said, Paul then stood up in the meeting of the Areopagus and said, people of, here's the deal, same thing as Peter did, Athens, not Jerusalem, people of Athens. I see that in every way that you are very religious. The same context. Again, here's the deal. Paul does the same thing Peter does. He starts with context. And these people are not from Jerusalem. They've got a different background. They've got different understandings. They're from Athens. They're very religious. It's not that they didn't know anything about the gods. They actually worshiped multiple gods. But then the very next line, and this is so important, this is where I think is lost in the modern day church. It's what we've got to reclaim on some level. He says this, for as I walked around and looked carefully at your objects of worship. See, Paul is going to leverage culture to lead people to Christ. Paul is going to study their culture before he leads them to his culture. Paul is going to look and he's going to say, listen, no, I've been here for a while and I've been walking around. I've been looking at all of your stuff. Modern day, it's like if somebody quotes like a Will Ferrell movie, okay? Those are funny, by the way, okay? So if somebody quotes, that's culture. Paul says, listen, I've been walking around. I look carefully at your objects of worship. I even found an altar with this inscription, to an unknown God. Paul is looking for an opening. He's studying the culture. He's studying the people. And they're very different. In fact, here's the deal. After he addressed the context, Paul did the same thing Peter did. He moved on to culture. And they don't know Yahweh. And they don't know who the prophet Joel is. And they've probably never picked up an Old Testament scripture. But they understand the concept of gods. And he's finding a way to speak to them, to meet them where they're at so that he can lead them to where they need to be. And so the very next line is this. He says this. So you are ignorant. It's not the best way to win friends and influence people. But anyway, you are ignorant of the very thing you worship. And this is what I'm going to proclaim to you. Ignorance is not about emotion. It's about intellect. Ignorance is not about you're kind of dumb. Actually, ignorance isn't stupid. It's just you've never been exposed to. That's what ignorance is. And so, unlike, and this is the difference, Peter, Paul uses intellect over emotion. He says, I'm going to talk to you. I'm going to walk you through all these different things from an intellectual standpoint. I'm going to start where you're at. I'm going to start with your context, with your gods and your culture, and I'm going to lead you to my Christ, but I'm going to do it in a very different way than Peter did it. And again, there's a lot of churches that do that today. I would suggest that that's kind of our model for how we walk through it. We try to use intellect. We're not high on emotion. We don't speak to that. There's nothing wrong with that. But the context is there's not a right way to do church. There's some wrong ways, absolutely, but there's no one right way. In fact, Paul even writes about this to a church just to make sure that they're clear on the whole deal in Galatians. And he says it this way. For the same God, and I love that, this is the same God. All the different denominations, all the different churches, we worship the same God. All right? That's really important. It's really easy to be divisive and be like, okay, we got the Methodists over here, we got the Baptists over here, we got the Presbyterians over here, we got the non-denominations who know what they believe. We got all these people no, it's the same God. The same God who worked through Peter as the apostle to the Jews also worked through me as the apostle to the Gentiles. Same God, different people, different group you're preaching to. And what I want you to see today is this, just one of the key things is this. Next slide. The churches should aspire to complete and not compete with each other. The River Lake, our passion really is to complete what we would call the big C church, the capital church, God's kingdom church, not little C church, not each individual church. We're not competing with the churches. We're trying to complete them. And how we do that is for us to live out our mission to be unlike anyone else. Why? Because we're not competing with them. To reach everyone else. Why? Because we're trying to complete God's church. And so we kind of start to talk about what this looks like. It looks like specifically for us 3 things. Number 1 is this, what we look like. It's our building, it's our dress, it's so many different things. I mean, listen, I've read it before. There's nothing in here that talks about what the building should look like. But isn't it true most churches' buildings look the same? I mean, they're beautiful buildings, stained glass windows, a lot of them, and they got this wonderful steeple, really this high steeple. And every now and then people are like, Nick, where's your steeple? I'm like, well, we don't need one. Why? Well, because do you know, and this is important, do you know why there was a steeple? Because years ago, before we had technology, in a town, when chaos happened, or you need help, or whatever, you didn't know where to go, and so you looked up, and the point of the church was to have the highest point. They would build these tall steeples above the trees and above the other buildings and everything like that, so that no matter where you were at, you could look up and see across somewhere and know exactly where to go. You know what the bottom line is? We don't need that anymore. We have Google Maps, right? I don't need you to see the church. I need you to attend the church, all right? There's a big difference, all right? So our building looks more like culture than it does the church because there's nothing in there. It's what we look like. Do you know why we don't wear suits on Sunday mornings? Because listen, here's the deal. This is going to shock some of you. The disciples did not wear suits to church. Do you know when the church started wearing suits and Sunday best? When culture wore suits. Do you know why we don't wear suits on Sunday morning anymore? And if you have a suit, that's okay. We're good. Because culture doesn't wear suits. Do you know why your pastor wears orange, bright shoes on Sunday mornings? Because they just look cool. That's why, right? And we will be unlike anyone else to reach everyone else. What we look like, it's incredibly simple, but what I want you to hear, my heart with this whole thing is this. I never, ever want the building to get in the way of what God's building inside them. I never want what we look like. I mean, so for the longest time, our parking lot looked like trash, and I was really okay with it. We never spent any money on it until it became a problem and a health hazard, and people started following, and we had to kind of fix some stuff. But for the longest time, I was fine. I didn't care what the parking lot looked like because I'm not worried about what the external building looks like. I'm worried about what we look like inside. And for far too often and far too long, the church is worried about what it looks like externally and not internally. And so we're just walking through it. You just need to understand, I'm not super convinced and I'm not super focused on what we look like externally. I don't care. Which leads to number 2. It's what we say. Now, if you hang out with us, you're going to hear us talk about 2 things a lot. We're going to talk quite a bit about sex and money, all right? Do you know why that is? Because again, every now and then people are like, Nick, you talk a lot about sex and money. You talk a lot about, here's why. Because this does. If you read the Gospels, Jesus speaks more about money than heaven, hell, and love combined. You miss it because back then they didn't have dollar bills. They just had sheep. They had grain. They had barns. That was their money. And so you miss the point in all the illustrations where Jesus is saying, no, you don't understand. The biggest thing for your heart, he even says it clearly, the biggest thing for your heart is not even Satan, it's your money. Your sex and what you do with that, your sexuality, that will rob you of so much. In fact, if you read the church epistles, which epistle is a fancy word, that just means there is a whole bunch of letters written to the churches in the first part of the church. If you read them, all of them, but one, talk about sex and money. Only a few of them talk about evangelism. But if you go to a lot of churches today, their focus is going to be evangelism, got to get people in there. And I would say, listen, I'm not sure that's the focus. Here's what I think. I think Jesus believes if I can get Jesus in the people will go evangelize naturally. That you don't have to worry about evangelism. Evangelism is a result of what happens internally inside of us. And so can you imagine if the church would just get sex and money right, how different the world would be around it? If we just get those two things right, but the divorce rates, all the issues, are just like the world. The debt rates, the credit card rates, everything's just like the world. So we wonder, why don't we have the power? Why don't we have the authority? Why don't we have the influence? Because we're not even doing the very basic things that God's talking about. We're going to talk a lot, and every single year, we talk about a lot of it. In fact, every single year, I do a series called LSD, Love, Sex, and Dating. It'll be Valentine's Day next year. Shocker. And at the end of the year, we do a money series. In fact, I had somebody get mad at me last year. They're like, I can't believe you're doing a money series over Christmas. And I'm like, what better time? Anyway, so you know why? Because here's the deal. This is really, really important, and this is what guides our conversations, and it talks a lot about those two topics, which leads to the second thing. When I talk about those topics, you just need to understand. I'm going to preach. My model is much more like Paul's than it is Peter's, meaning I'm going to start with culture. I'm going to start with context. I'm going to assume that you know nothing about God. I'm going to assume that you don't know God. I'm going to assume that you probably don't even want to be here. So every sermon almost takes me 6 to 8 minutes to get to the Bible. And again, if you grew up in the church and you're just sitting back and you're like, okay, Nick, where do we get the Bible? Why does it take so long to get the Bible? I'll tell you why, because that's a model that was given to us by Paul. And here's why that's a problem, because what happens in the church world is we have confused preparation with presentation. And the assumption is if I stand up here and it takes me 10 minutes to get the Bible, then I must have started with culture in my preparation. No, that is not true. In fact, almost every sermon that I preach comes out of my quiet time a year or 2 or 3 beforehand. Because I'm about a year out in my messages and I'm sitting back and I'm taking the things that God's shown me privately and I'm just putting them away going, okay, I'm going to talk about that sometime. I'm going to talk about that sometime. Okay, we're going to talk about that next year. And other than our money series and our sex series, which we do every year, everything else comes out of that. Here's the deal. We separate those two. My preparation starts with God's word and the foundation for everything that I say. My presentation starts with culture and context of who I'm trying to reach. It's radically different. But if we confuse the two, then we will be like my friend who looks at my axe throwing and says, I can't believe you started with culture. I can't believe you started with axe throwing. Why didn't you start with, why don't you be more like Jesus? Because that's not where they're at. They don't care about Jesus. They might care about axe throwing. And I'm really okay with that, which leads to our last thing that applies for us. It's what we do. And again, I said up front, we do 2 things, and really only 2 things. We're going to have ridiculous events, and I own it. It's ridiculous events. And we're going to be radically generous. Ridiculous events, we're going to continue to do things. In fact, we've got something come up, and they canceled it for Father's Day, so I apologize ahead of time, but I'm not going to be here. But when we do it, it's going to be epic, okay? That's all I'm going to say, all right? And you're going to be like, that is ridiculous. It's going to be awesome. Anyway, I can't even talk about it, but I'm a little upset. But anyway, so it's fine. But we're going to continue to do that. For the rest, as long as I'm the pastor, we're going to figure out what can we do that's ridiculous? What can we do that's short of sin? Okay, we're not going to sin. That's going to help bring people who don't know God to God. I'm really comfortable with that. I think Jesus did that. And then we're going to be radically generous with all of our stuff. Do you know why? Jesus did that. Jesus, don't miss this, because you can super spiritualize the moments in the Gospels, and I get this. Listen, Jesus leveraged temporal things for an eternal impact. What I mean by that is he had no problem going, you get a Happy Meal, you get a Happy Meal, you get a Lunchable, you get a Lunchable, you get lobster, I like you. You know, he's constantly doing stuff. He's constantly feeding people. He went to a party and made 150 gallons of wine. Who doesn't like that dude? He was instantly on every wedding guest. Like, you don't even know Jesus. It's okay, cool, just be cool, it'd be great. Yeah, just bring him. He healed people left and right. And here's the deal, listen, don't miss this because you can read the stories and maybe you've never read them like this. Most of the people didn't want Jesus, they just wanted his blessing. So when we give stuff away, and the pushback is, Nick, you know the only reason that people showed up is for your free stuff. I'm going, duh. That's what Jesus did. And just like Jesus, there may be 9 that show up for the blessing and never come back, but if there's one that stays, we've won the battle. So we will constantly, very delayed, but that's okay. Yeah, it's okay. Took you a bit. Oh, that is a good thing. Yeah. All right. Yeah. Some of you weren't even paying attention. Like people were clapping. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. What are we talking about? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Give it away. Yeah. So we do that. I mean, listen. Here's the deal. Let me show you how. 3 weeks ago, we gave away T-shirts, free T-shirts. You know, it's just a simple T-shirt. Okay. Like it was our highest attended day in forever. Do you know why? Because people are cheap and $10 is worth a lot to them. They're like, I'll take a T-shirt. That's great. And they showed up and it's great. We will consistently do that. I will not apologize for that. It is why we do what we do. We will start with culture and we will invite them to follow our Christ. It's what we do. We will be unlike anyone else to reach everyone else. And all that said, the question is, what does it mean for you? Well, here's what it means. I want to encourage you to do 2 things. Number 1, and I get that, and maybe you're watching online and you just kind of watching for a while, whatever. I'm telling you why we do what we do because I want you to join. Today's kind of an invitation. It's an insight. It's a behind-the-scenes look at kind of the why we do. So maybe you've sat back and you've thought that. You sit back and go, I kind of like the church, but man, I don't like where they spend their money or what they do, or I wish they didn't have those events, or I can't believe they're just spending money on omelets and whatever. And like today, maybe an insight, and you kind of go, I get it. And it's an invitation for you to join us. For you to kind of maybe jump in. Maybe you've been kind of walking through this whole deal, like, I don't know if I want to join the church and kind of be in there, whole deal. Like, listen, today's your day to kind of jump in and to start to serve and start to give and start to be a part of what we're doing to help us make it easy for everyone to find and follow Jesus. For some of you, that's it. But more importantly than that, I want you to start to ask a question. Whether you ever give or you ever serve, that's okay. I want you to ask a different question. I want you to ask this question right here. Who's next? See, we have a church that does not assume that anybody knows anything about God. We have a church that does ridiculous and radical events. We have a church where I hope and I pray that you feel comfortable bringing your non-Christian friends because you know what you're going to get. You know exactly that you're going to be welcomed like crazy in the parking lot. Soon to be a new parking lot. It's going to be beautiful. You have a church that you know they're going to feel not just welcomed, but accepted. In fact, they're going to get a free T-shirt, and the next Sunday they can wear that T-shirt, and they're just part of the club. There's no insiders. There's no outsiders. You have a church that you can feel free that the pastor might say something offensive, sarcastic, okay? But it's not going to start from the wrong place. There's a church that will do anything short of sin to make it easy for everyone to find and follow Jesus. So more than anything, my hope and prayer is that you start to ask the question, who's next? And you'd be willing to invite them. You'd be willing to sit back and go, listen, I'm so grateful that I found this church. I'm so grateful what God's done in my life. Who's next? I was first. God, who's next on my radar? Who do I need to bring? Who do I need to help? Who do I need to start to pray for, maybe for an opening? I don't know what it is. This whole series is based on the question, what's next? But I will tell you, for many of you, what's next is who's next. That's how we flip this town upside down. When as a church, we stop competing with each other and we start completing each other. I want to end with a quote that is so River Lake. Most good pastors would end with a Bible verse. I'm going to end with Gandhi, okay? It's a little bit different, all right? If you're like, what? Yeah, welcome to River Lake Church, okay? But I love this quote because it deals with what I think the heart of the matter is for the church today. And it's this right here. He says, I like your Christ. I do not like your Christians. Your Christians are so unlike your Christ. Do you know the problem with the local church? It's competing. It's backbiting. It's drawing lines. It's gossiping. It's slander. It's not getting sex and our money right. It's being stingy. It's not being generous. It's not being ridiculous with their events. It's doing all the things wrong and then expecting the right results. And can you imagine if we would just fix that? If we'd start just really, I have so many pastors in the area. They're wonderful pastors. They're great churches. If we would start to be the church, the real church, the church that gets context and culture and starts there, the church that understands the power of radical generosity, of ridiculous events, the church that understands that culture is meant to lead people to Christ. And we would ask who's next. We would flip this town upside down. That's exactly what our plan is. Today is an invitation more than anything to join what God has already done. The first 10 years were great. It's nothing compared to the next. So, happy Mother's Day. Would you all stand with me? I want to pray for you. Let's pray. God, first and foremost, thank you for your Son who died on the cross to give us hope, to give us healing, to give us a reason to come together to celebrate who you are in our lives. It's the same God throughout the world right now. People are worshiping all over. One God, one Savior, one Spirit. Thank you, Jesus. Let us be unified under that. Let us be the real church. And God, I pray for this specific church that you would help us walk with intentionality of asking who's next. Help us be the church. Help us honor you in all that we do, God. We love you and we thank you. Amen.